Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is Miss Gooding, and I'm here to talk about the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age took place approximately toward the end of the Civil War. Some people believe it began with the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, simply because that's when the government regulations and subsidies started to happen. Others place it closer to the end of Reconstruction, but it typically goes through the 1900s, early 1900s, and then it hands it off to the Progressive era. So this first part is going to be about the rise of industry during the Gilded Age. How did it get its name? All right. So gilded is the concept that something can be covered with gold on the outside, but not all the way through. And this term was coined by Mark Twain in a book that he wrote in 1873. And this tale that he told was about corruption and greed that really encapsulates the Gilded Age. And so the name stuck because during the Gilded Age, there were a handful of people that were making a tremendous amount of money. And things for them looked great on the outside. But then when you looked closely at the Gilded Age, there were a lot of people not doing very well. There was a lot of greed. There was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of poverty. And so that metaphor of gilded, gold on the outside, rotten in the center, is really what Mark Twain was referring to with regards to this era of history. So that's where it got its name. This time period was a period of rapid industrial growth. So, first of all, the number of factories boomed during the Gilded Age. There was an extraordinary amount of businesses and industries growing that needed workers and needed factories to create goods and items for people, for the economy. And the types of factories were very broad. So we had meat packing plants. There was clothing and textiles. There was steel and shipping and eventually automobiles and all of the other things that are needed to create automobiles or shipping. And so it was a time of great growth. The number of jobs also increased in the United States, especially in the cities. People, often Americans that were already living in rural areas, they would choose during this time period to pack up and move to the cities because there were better jobs and opportunities there at the time. Immigrants were also coming to the New World, and they were in search of jobs. And people were coming from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and they were finding jobs, and they were finding jobs in cities, in factories. So the cities were growing rapidly. Factories, homes, apartments, tenement housing, all of it was going on during this time. And of course, we all know that America is blessed with an abundance of natural resources. And so there was kind of an endless supply. And I use endless loosely as a term. So we know that we had steel, we had oil, we had coal, as well as a variety of other natural resources, which also kind of aided the Gilded Age. This time was a period of optimism and progress. So you see this chart here. This is some of the things that were improving, according to some. This is 1860. 1900, and then the percentage of increase. So just starting out with factories. In 1860, there were 140,500. By 1900, 510,000. That is a 263 degree or a percentage increase. And then the value of factory production, 1.9 billion to 13 billion in 40 years. 584% increase. So the number of workers went from 1.3 million to 5.1 million in 40 years, 292% increase. And you can see the number of barrels of oil. You can see the miles of railroad track, the tons of steel produced. Check out the steel produced. The percentage of increase is 9,762. That is incredible. So when I say the rise of industry, this is an example of why, and the opportunities that people were presented. However, these individuals who were working for these robber barons and for these captains of industry, which I'll get to that in a second, were not necessarily taken well care of. And you will probably learn more about that when you listen to my lecture about Jacob Riis. There were also a lot of new industries. I've already mentioned oil and coal and steel, but there were also new inventions as well. So there were things like typewriters and vacuums, things, to kind of make the domestic life a little bit easier, sewing machines. But there was also, growing industries of salt and the telephone, the telegraph, and construction. And you get the construction because so many people were moving to the cities and they needed to build these factories and housing for these new individuals coming into more of a industrial place, industrial cities. Some of the steel projects that happened during the Gilded Age were pretty major. And a lot of them are still standing today because they were built very, very well. But these steel projects largely were bridges to carry cars and to carry trains. And so, you see this top picture here in the right-hand corner. That was no small, easy feat, to build that. So those types of projects were going on all over the place. Another type of project that was going on because there were so many people moving to the cities and the cities were becoming more and more densely populated, is skyscrapers. And so they were, instead of building buildings out, they were building buildings up. And they were doing tenement housing and also factories with multiple stories. And to make sure that they were safe, kind of safe, and we'll get to that a little bit later, they use steel. And so the steel production was taking off during this time for a lot of different reasons. The Transcontinental Railroad also boomed during this time period. So you can see on the left-hand side, this is 1840, so before the Civil War. And as you recall, the South was dragged behind the North with regards to the railroad, and that was because Abraham Lincoln kind of sabotaged it. The railroad was a blessing to the North because we were able to transport goods and items and weapons to soldiers in various places where they were fighting. Well, Abraham Lincoln didn't want the South to have that luxury, and so it was sabotaged. But in the 1840s, you can see how few railroad miles there were. And then 1860, I don't have a picture of that one. There were more, but they were predominantly in the North. And then by the time we get to 1890, they're all over the United States. And during the Gilded Age, it was really important to have these railroad systems so that industries could pack up their goods and get them across the country in a relatively short amount of time. And that also helped the economy. And these companies make their money. So in 1840, total trackage, 2,818 versus in 1890, total trackage was 208,152. So a huge, tremendous amount of growth. The men who built America, there were a handful of very, very rich and powerful individuals. And I have mentioned Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie his industry was steel. John D. Rockefeller was oil. And those two individuals are here. This is Andrew Carnegie and this is Rockefeller. J.P. Morgan made a name for himself with banking, Henry Ford, automobile, and then Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroad and shipping. And so this was just a handful of these men who helped build America. All right, these men who built America, some of them were considered robber barons and some of them were considered captains of industry. So on the left-hand side, robber barons. This term is kind of derogatory or critical, and it describes these industrialists who are after money and they aren't necessarily looking out for anybody but themselves and their own wealth and their own success. Whereas a captain of industry is a person who is financially well off, they're very successful, they may be an incredibly successful entrepreneur and businessman, but they also look out for others. They donate things back into their community. They want to watch out for the smaller person. I would argue that Andrew Carnegie would be either a captain of industry. I don't know if he'd fit into the robber baron completely. He did a lot for New York City with regards to their library system, and he also really contributed to the art scene in that area as well. So I wouldn't necessarily put him as a complete robber baron, but that kind of is an example of these terms. All right, a cartoon, political cartoon about our industry. So here we have water and we have a raft. And obviously, these individuals up here are some of our robber barons or captains of industry. Here's Vanderbilt, here's Gould. And they are atop this raft sitting on sandbags, and they have their eyes closed. They're snoozing. They're just completely oblivious to what's going on. And then underneath this raft, these individuals are holding this raft up from the rough waters. And you can tell that these individuals underneath here are probably laborers. They're holding tools. They're dressed like laborers. They might be, this guy might be a meat packing, I don't know exactly, but they're from the factories. And so this is an image and a portrayal of who is actually protecting our industry. And according to this cartoon, it's the factory workers that are protecting and holding up, the industries themselves. And I think it's pretty critical toward the captains of industry or the robber barons. To give you an idea of the lap of luxury that these men who built America lived in, this is the Vanderbilt House in New York City. You can see how big it is if you look at the people down below. I don't know how many rooms are in that. Be easy to figure it out, but it's pretty big. This is the Rockefeller House in Cleveland, Ohio. Also a fairly nice establishment. And this is the Carnegie Mansion of New York. All right, the next part 2 is going to actually be of my lectures is going to be about the corruption and greed during the Gilded Age. Thank you for listening.